Thank you, Peter. Thank you, dear friends, for gathering here today for this very important meeting. It is a pleasure to be back here in the Netherlands, back here in The Hague. I've been to The Hague before, but never to Scheveningen. This is my first time in this beautiful neighborhood, but of course I have heard the name many times on the news because it was here, somewhere in this neighborhood, that former Serbian dictator, the Butcher of the Balkans, Slobodan Milosevic, spent the last years of his life after having been brought to account for all the horrendous crimes he has committed. This past June, during the summer session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, the Council of Europe announced a historic decision in an agreement with the government of Ukraine. They have signed a treaty on the creation of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Informally, in the corridors of the Council of Europe, it's being dubbed a tribunal for Putin because, by its definition, while war crimes and crimes against humanity can be committed by anybody with any rank, from the regular soldier, the crime of aggression, by definition, can only be committed by somebody who has the power to make the decision to launch an aggression. And so it is my sincere hope that one day Mr. Putin too will spend his last years in this neighborhood being held to account for everything he has done to the people of Ukraine, to the people of Georgia, to the people of Syria, and to our own people in Russia, whom he has misruled, murdered, imprisoned for these past 25 years. This year marks 25 years, exactly a quarter of a century, since Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia. There is a sort of a fashionable myth that is sometimes perpetrated by policymakers, analysts, politicians, very often for reasons of self-justification, that there were somehow two different Putins. There was an early Putin who was okay, who was a modernizer, a reformer, who believed in the rule of law and cooperation with the West. And then something went horribly wrong along the way. Nothing could be further from the truth. Vladimir Putin was Vladimir Putin from the very beginning. I remember the precise date. It's going to sound weird, but you'll understand why. I remember the precise date I understood who this man was and what direction he was going to take our country. It was the 20th of December, 1999, the day still astonishingly celebrated by the Russian security services as Chekist Day, to commemorate the founding of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, on the 20th of December, 1917. On that day, Mr. Putin came to Lubyanka, the headquarters of the former KGB, now the FSB, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Yuri Andropov was somebody who embodied everything that was wrong with the Soviet system, both in terms of the internal repression and in terms of the external aggression. He was one of the architects of the 1956 invasion of Hungary, the Soviet ambassador to Budapest. He was a longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB who prioritized the suppression, the destruction, the silencing of domestic political dissent. He created a special directorate within the KGB specifically to go after dissidents. He practiced and expanded the horrendous policy of so-called punitive psychiatry when dissidents, people who were opposed to the communist system, were declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in so-called psychiatric hospitals and subjected to forced so-called psychiatric treatment. This is the man who symbolized everything that was wrong with the communist system. And it was to him that Vladimir Putin, then Prime Minister of Russia, chose to unveil a memorial plaque on the facade of the main Russian security service. After that day, I had no more questions. Russia is a country of symbols, and Putin could not have chosen a more powerful or a more clear symbol to signify the direction he was going to go. And just in case anybody still had questions, as one of his first acts when he became president of Russia in 2000, Putin reinstated the Soviet-era national anthem, once personally picked by Joseph Stalin as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. Again, Russia is a country of symbols. But it was not long before symbols were followed by actions, as Putin moved to dismantle our fragile, weak, imperfect, but real democracy that we had back in the 1990s, with competitive elections, a pluralistic parliament, independent media. He was determined to destroy all of that, and he had a very clear plan ahead. Sometimes people have this conception that democracies are destroyed in a military coup or a violent uprising or revolution or something like this. I mean, it does happen often too, but also very often democracies are destroyed from within by using the tools in the system of democracy itself. And this is exactly how Vladimir Putin went about doing it. Benito Mussolini once remarked that he had consolidated his fascist regime in Italy in the early 1920s in the manner of, and I quote, plucking the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking, end of quote. This was the phrase he used, meaning don't do it all at once. Do it gradually, do it slowly. It'll be easier that way. And this is exactly how Putin did it. He was a good student of Mussolini in this regard. The first feather he plucked were independent media, of course, something that is incompatible with any dictatorship. In one of his early interviews as acting president at the beginning of 2000, Putin said a phrase that sort of surprised many of you. What did he mean by that? He said, "Those who will offend us will not survive 3 days. Кто нас обидит, 3 дней не проживет," in Russian. And it turned out he meant it almost literally, because on day 4, after his inauguration as president of Russia in May 2000, he sent armed operatives from the FSB, the Prosecutor General Service, and the tax police to raid the offices of Media Most, which was the largest private media holding in Russia at the time, and the parent company of NTV, the most watched, the most successful, the most popular independent television channel in Russia that was known for its fiercely independent news coverage, sharp analysis, hard-hitting political satire, which is something that dictators especially hate. It was within a year of his coming to power that NTV was silenced in an early dawn raid on its offices, on its studios at Moscow's Ostankino Television Center in April 2001. And within 2 years of coming to power, 3 years, by June of 2003, Vladimir Putin silenced every single nationwide television channel in our country that was independent from the state, ensuring that the state, just like back in the communist times, now had a total monopoly over the airwaves. This happened in June of 2003 when Putin's government pulled the plug on TVS, which was the last privately held independent television channel in Russia. That year, 2003, was in many ways a turning point. The sort of 3 major feathers that Putin plucked, again, to go back to the Mussolini metaphor, on the road to the destruction of Russian democracy. June was the destruction of the silencing of the last independent TV channel. In October of 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then Russia's richest man, an oil tycoon, an oligarch, one of the oligarchs that, that term was famous at the time, but he wasn't just an oligarch, he was also a philanthropist who spent his money supporting educational projects, civil society groups, media organizations, and most unpleasantly for the Kremlin, he also spent his money supporting opposition parties and candidates in elections. And at one meeting, televised meeting in the Kremlin in early 2003, Khodorkovsky publicly accused Putin's government of corruption. It was only a question of time before the Kremlin would strike back. And one early morning in October of 2003, when Khodorkovsky's private jet landed for a refueling stop at Novosibirsk airport, the plane was raided by an FSB special ops team. He was put on another plane, flown back to Moscow, and driven to a courtroom where he was paraded on state television, sitting literally in a metal cage. The richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. This was not just about silencing Khodorkovsky himself, who would spend more than a decade in Putin's prisons. It was also about sending a message to the rest of Russia's business community to toe the line. If you behave like him, you'll end up like this. And that was a message that was certainly heeded. And then the final straw came in December of 2003, that same year, when Russia held parliamentary elections that were famously, or perhaps infamously described by the Council of Europe observation mission, David Atkinson, who headed the observation team, as, and I quote, free, but certainly not fair, end of quote. I can confirm that that was the case. I was a parliamentary candidate in a district in southern Moscow in that election for the liberal opposition. That election was still free in the sense that people like me could be candidates on the ballot. Today that's unthinkable. But it was, of course, not fair because the results were pre-programmed by the full might of the Russian state through administrative coercion, through the total state dominance of the media, and so on. And the result of that election was a parliament that was devoid of any real, any meaningful opposition. The 2 major pro-democracy parties, the Union of Right Forces and Yabloko, were kicked out of the legislature. And the new Speaker of Parliament, who became Speaker after that election, a man by the name of Boris Gryzlov, Putin's colleague in his ruling United Russia Party, when he opened the session of that new parliament, that opposition-free parliament in December of 2003, he said a phrase that I think will go down in future history textbooks as an epitaph for the Putin regime. What he said, and I quote, that parliament is not a place for discussion, end of quote. This is how it's been in our country ever since. Full speed ahead towards authoritarianism and then totalitarianism. All the feathers have long been plucked. And Putin had two major allies on his road to the destruction of Russian democracy: domestic indifference and foreign acquiescence. Two, in my view, equally as responsible as each other. To go back to that election again in 2003, I remember how shocking it was for me. My whole campaign, just as my party's campaign, was built around the need to protect democratic institutions that were being destroyed in front of our eyes. And most people just simply didn't seem to care. People were all, consumed with bread and butter issues and kitchen table issues. As they say, Putin was really fortunate in the timing of his coming to power. In 1998, during the Russian financial crisis, in August of 98, when Boris Yeltsin was president, the world prices of oil were about $10 US per barrel. By the time Putin got to power, they were 25. By the end of his first year, they were 35. By the third year, 50. By the end of his second term, they reached a whopping $150 per barrel, 15 times more than under Boris Yeltsin. Oil revenues, of course, as you know, are the biggest contributor to the Russian budget. And it's not difficult to improve economic conditions when your budgetary revenue just goes through the roof. And so the early 2000s were a time of rising prosperity in Russia, especially for people living in big cities. People were able to afford, new domestic appliances, new cars, new apartments sometimes, holidays abroad. And people just switched off from politics. They said, it's not that they supported Putin, it's not that they supported his drive to dismantle democracy, they just didn't care. And as we know from history, apathy and indifference is a major ally of any dictatorship, and this was certainly the case in Russia in the early 2000s. But it was not the only factor that helped Putin along his way. The other factor, as I mentioned, was foreign Western acquiescence. Putin was not just fortunate, with the prices of oil. He was fortunate with encountering Western leaders who chose to deliberately turn a blind eye on his very clear campaign to dismantle democracy in Russia. It was just as shocking, I remember very well, to see the leaders of countries that are supposedly, the guardians, the guarantors of such notions as the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, just giving Putin a free pass. I remember, one American president, George Bush, who was looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul and praising him for whatever, he was doing. I remember another American president, Barack Obama, who pushed reset buttons with Putin and praised him for the great work he was doing on behalf of the Russian people. And it wasn't just the Americans. All over Western Europe, heads of state and government deliberately looked the other way in a hope of continuing business as usual with Vladimir Putin, in both the literal but also the political sense of this term. I mean, some of the more extreme examples we know, like Gerhard Schröder, the German chancellor, who literally just sold himself to Putin in a direct sense of this word. But that's on the extreme side. There were many others who didn't have maybe a personal financial incentive, but they still engaged in this shameful policy of enabling and appeasement. I'll never forget June 2003. I mentioned already that was the month that Putin's government silenced the last independent TV channel, so essentially establishing total state monopoly on television, destroying freedom of the media in an important way in our country. 2 days after he'd done that, Putin was hosted for a state visit to the United Kingdom in London. I was working as a journalist at the time. I was covering that visit. And I couldn't believe my own eyes when, not only did the British hosts not cancel the visit, forget about it, not only did they not find even a few words of criticism, but it was so mind-boggling to see, this man who had just destroyed freedom of the media in the largest country in the world being treated to a ride with the Queen of England down Horse Guards Parade, a reception at Buckingham Palace. I remember there was one particularly lavish banquet at the London Guildhall, where the who is who of Britain's financial and political elites present there, you know, people dressed in black tie, raising their champagne glasses, drinking to Putin's health, singing, "Oh, he is a jolly good fellow." It was absolutely mind-boggling. What kind of a message should Putin have received? Well, obviously the only one possible, that they don't care, that I can do whatever I want. And so he proceeded with doing whatever he wanted. Not only, in my view, was this Western policy immoral, it was also extremely short-sighted and impractical, because those Western leaders who chose to turn a blind eye on Putin's destruction of democracy at home in a hope of continuing to deal with him and to engage in business as usual on the international level, they forgot or ignored a fundamental lesson of Russian history, which is that internal repression and external aggression are two sides of the same coin. A government that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors. It's not going to respect the norms and rules of international law. And so sure enough, those Western leaders who chose for years to turn a blind eye on media censorship in Russia, on political repression in Russia, on election rigging in Russia, and so on, one day woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe, state-to-state territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which is what Putin did with Crimea in 2014. And of course, now we're living in the reality of the largest military conflict on European soil since the Second World War, which is what Vladimir Putin is waging in Ukraine. I remember that, one of the clearest analyses of this situation, not in relation to the present day, but in relation to 50 years ago, was made by Vladimir Bukovsky, a legendary Soviet-era dissident, who I think is well known in this country because there was a very important international campaign in his support back in the 70s, which resulted in his release and exchange in 1976. Talking about his first impressions of life in the West, of politics in the West, once he was expelled from the Soviet Union from prison, Bukovsky said that the problem is that for too many Western politicians, the ability to fry their morning bacon on Soviet gas is more important than any human rights concerns. That was 50 years ago. We replaced the word Soviet with Russian, and not much has changed. But if that was the case with everybody in Western politics, then it would be a really sad and tragic story, and I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. Because in my years in politics, both in Russia and internationally, I've been fortunate to meet people who defy this stereotype. People for whom human rights are more important than bacon. People who still believe in principle and values and commitment in international politics. And one of these people is the reason we're all gathered here today, my good friend Pieter Omtzigt. We met, must have been more than a decade ago, at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, where Peter represented the Netherlands for many years. While I was engaged in an international advocacy campaign for the Magnitsky sanctions that Bill Browder already talked about here in the first part of this conference. You know, for years and years we had this absolutely intolerable situation where the key officials and key oligarchs of the Putin regime, the same people who destroyed the most basic tenets of democratic society in our country, were continuing to enjoy the benefits and the privileges of democratic society in the West. Because it was in the West where all these people bought homes, yachts, nice cars, kept their bank accounts, sent their wives and their mistresses on shopping trips and so on. So they'd gotten used to stealing in Russia, but then spending and stashing away that money in the West. And that was, needless to say, enormous hypocrisy on their part. But it was also shameful enabling on the part of those Western countries that, was supposedly standing in defense of the rule of law and democracy and human rights, but actually were all too willing to accept these individuals and their dirty money, in many cases blood-stained money, as in the case of the Magnitsky affair. It's been said that the largest export from the Putin regime to the West was not oil or gas, it was corruption. And I fully share the sentiment, but that is a two-way street, of course. For somebody to be able to export corruption, someone else needs to be willing to import it. And there has been no shortage of people. Gerald Knaus in the first part of the session talked at length about only one case, but a very important one of corruption within the Council of Europe, but there were many such cases. And so the idea behind the Magnitsky Act was to put a stop to this, to put a stop to the double standard, to the hypocrisy, to the enabling by laying down a very clear principle that those people, initially it concerned only Russia, but now this principle is spread to any authoritarian government around the world, that those people who are personally complicit in human rights abuses or corruption will no longer be able to enjoy the benefits and privileges of democratic society, will no longer be able to get visas, own assets, or use the financial and banking systems of Western democracies. When we began this work, it was Boris Nemtsov who got me involved in this work back in 2010. We first began it on the other side of the Atlantic in the American Congress, and there was enormous pressure, enormous opposition, not just from the Kremlin side, I mean, that's obvious, but also from Western political circles, for people who are interested in continuing this business as usual. And I remember that at the beginning of this work, people would just say to us, you know, well, it's never going to happen. The interests are too powerful. You know, the resistance is too strong. You never get it done. But thanks to people like the late Senator John McCain in America, thanks to people like Pieter Omtzigt here in Europe, I'm proud to stand here today and say that 35 different countries and jurisdictions around the world, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and every single member state of the European Union has Magnitsky laws on their books and has this very clear principle enshrined in the legislation that those people who abuse and attack the basic tenets of democracy in their countries will no longer be able to enjoy the benefits of democracy in yours. And without Peter and without his leadership, I do not think we would have been in this situation today, especially given that, as you all know, and as Bill Browder already talked about today, the reason the European Union-wide human rights sanctions mechanism exists is because it was initiated at the Parliament of the Netherlands. And there was another very important issue that we worked about with Peter. In fact, we met, this was for the last time before my arrest, in January of 2022. This was the last session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe when Russia was still a member. It would be expelled in March after Putin invaded Ukraine. We sat for dinner in a small cafe, Al Noi it was called. It was closed, by the way. I was there last week for the session. It's closed. They're redoing it. It's going to be an Italian place or something. Just across the park from the Council of Europe. And the topic we discussed was that it's well past time that the democratic world stops giving Putin the international legitimacy that he does not deserve. You know, everybody knows that we haven't had a free election in Russia for years. Everybody knows there are no independent media. Everybody knows that political opponents are never allowed on the ballot, that people who dare to oppose the Putin regime are murdered like Boris Nemtsov or Alexei Navalny, put in prison like so many thousands of my fellow citizens are forced into exile. And so given all of this already, it was difficult to speak of Putin as a legitimate head of state. But in 2020, as everybody was distracted by the COVID pandemic, Putin pushed through a couple of hundred different amendments to the Constitution, one of which, the most important one, and the reason that all of this exercise was actually put together, one of which gave him a personal exemption from presidential term limits. Again, not abolish presidential term limits. You know, there are other countries that have done that. A personal exemption, what lawyers call an ad hominem constitutional amendment, an amendment designed for a specific person. And he pushed it through in violation not only of Russia's international obligations, we're still in the Council of Europe, we're still in the OSCE, but also in very clear violations of Russian domestic law. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the way this was done violated not just the spirit of the law, which Putin was doing throughout his years in power, but also the specific letter of the law as well. And what we discussed with Peter that dinner in Strasbourg in January 2022 is that enough is enough. There has to be a red line here. There has to be a red line beyond which Putin steps, and the free world finally says, okay, this is enough. We will no longer grant you the recognition, the legitimacy that only can come from the ballot box, that only democracy can provide in the real world. And in a case where you even, formally speaking, violate all the last remaining norms of law in order of international obligations, this has to be the final red line beyond which the international community will not cross. And again, Peter, I have to be honest, just like when we began conversations about the Magnitsky Act, I thought this was never going to happen because, well, it's pretty revolutionary for a major international institution to declare Putin to be an illegitimate usurper. We all know he is, but it's one thing to know something and the other thing to have it enshrined in the authority of, in this case, the largest pan-European parliamentary organization. And so we had a conversation, we bid our farewell. A month later, Putin invaded Ukraine. Another month and a half later, I was in prison. I have to, be honest, I didn't have many good days and many good news when I was in prison. But one very good day came in October of 2023 when I got news in the letters that I was receiving that the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe overwhelmingly adopted a resolution that was based on a report by Pieter Omtzigt that Günther Schirmer, who is here, the former head of Secretariat of the Legal Affairs Committee, helped prepare it. And in that overwhelmingly adopted resolution, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe stated that Putin had remained in power in violation of the term limits, that from this moment on, specifically from the 7th of May of 2023, after the conclusion of his previous presidential term, he would become an illegitimate usurper. I cannot tell you how important it was to have a major international institution say loudly and clearly that despite everything that's going on in this world, 2 + 2 still equals 4. And if you stay in power without elections, with murdering or imprisoning your opponents, and if you just forget about constitutional term limits because you make a personal exemption for yourself, then the democratic nations of this world will no longer consider you to be a legitimate interlocutor. That resolution, apart from declaring Putin to be an illegitimate usurper, called on all Council of Europe member states to cease all contact with him except for cases of humanitarian needs, like prisoner exchanges or prisoner of war negotiations and so on. And it is so, not only so important, but so refreshing in this political climate dominated by cynicism and realpolitik and frying bacon, to go back to Bukowski's word. It's so refreshing to have Europe's largest interparliamentary body to make a statement as strong and as clear as this. And I have to say that just a few months later, the example set by Peter at the Council of Europe was followed by the European Parliament, which I think it was in June of 2024. Last year I was also still in prison, but I found out from the letters. The European Parliament did what you did at pace and passed exactly the same resolution. So now we have two largest parliamentary bodies on the European continent saying that 2 + 2 equals 4 and that Putin is an illegitimate usurper and a dictator and is not a legitimate interlocutor and a legitimate head of state. We often succumb to these feelings of pessimism and fatalism even, and doom and gloom and cynicism again about the state of politics, the state of the world we live in. There's too much of this cynicism, too much of this realpolitik, and too often, unfortunately, political life around us actually conforms to this prevailing stereotype. But it is so, so important to be able to meet people who prove the stereotype wrong, people who remind us that actually, despite everything, there still is room for principle and for values in international politics. I'm very grateful to know you, Peter, to have worked with you, and I could not have missed this invitation to be able to stand here and express my gratitude and respect. Thank you so very much.